This article describes the conventions for using people's names in France, including the norms of custom and practice, as well as the legal aspects. Styles and forms of address: Madame, Mademoiselle, Monsieur. In normal polite usage, a person's name is usually preceded by Monsieur, for males. Pronounced, Miam. Registered trademarks jar. Plural, Messieurs, pronounced, Mestre. Abbreviation, singular M. Plural, on the singular form Mr. is very often found, but is considered incorrect by purists, although it appears in some dictionaries. Madame, for females. Pronounced, Madame. Plural, Mesdames, pronounced, Mesdames. Abbreviation, MME. Plural, MMES. Madame must also be used in the case where one does not know whether the addressed woman is married or not, and in the case where one does not know whether the addressed woman consider the usage as discriminating or disrespectful. Mademoiselle, for an unmarried female. Pronounced, Mademoiselle, or, Mama shzel. Plural, Mesdemoiselles, pronounced, Mesdemoiselles, or, Membre shzel. Abbreviation, MLLE Omle. Plural, MLLES Omles. Etymologically, this means my damsel. This form of address is informal and is now tending to be less used in favor of madame by some groups such as women's rights movements, because they consider the usage to be discriminating and disrespectful. However, one tendency that remains fairly common is the addressing of young-looking females mademoiselle, and older females madame. Actresses are usually always styled mademoiselle, especially in film or theatre credits, regardless of their age or personal situation. One would thus read Mademoiselle de Neuviste-Hebila copyright E. Parsonzo. Mondemoiselle is an archaic term historically used for a gentleman that had not yet reached a status of chevalier, and was used in a similar fashion as the modern mademoiselle. Plural, mesdemoiselles. The term has not been in common use since the 17th century, but it can be found in works of classic French literature, such as Molière's Le Ver. More registered trademarked, for males and females. This title is used by lawyers and few other juridical professions, while carrying out their duties. Plural, more registered trademarked. Abbreviation, ME. There is no abbreviation for more registered trademarked. One should use MEX and MEY doctor, for males and females. This title is reserved for people having a doctorate but tend to be mostly used in everyday language for physician and dentists while carrying out their duties, even when still students thus not having yet a doctorate. Plural, doctors. Abbreviation, doctor. During the Ancien Roi copyright time, a laywoman was always addressed mademoiselle, even when married, madame being reserved to women of high aristocracy, even not married. This practice ceased after the French Revolution. A traditional address to a crowd of people is mesdames, messieurs or mesdames, mesdemoiselles, messieurs euro, whose order of words represents decreasing degrees of respect. An informal variant is messieurs dames. It is considered as ill-mannered by purists. It is normally impolite to address people by their given names unless one is a family member, a friend or a close work colleague of comparable hierarchic importance. One also does not address people by their last name only unless in a work environment. Also, contrary to English or German usage, it is considered impolite to address someone as Monsieur X when talking to that person. A mere Monsieur should be used, Monsieur X being reserved for talking about MX to another person. When speaking of someone, Monsieur Madame given name family name, by far the most polite form of address, is generally reserved for the most solemn occasions. Monsieur Madame family name or given name family name is polite and used in normal formal occasions, as well as in the formal quality press. By contrast, in colloquial usage the family names of personalities are used alone. Formally, a married or widowed woman can be called by the given name of her husband family name or Madame Vous family name. This is now slightly out of fashion, except on formal invitation cards. In France, on a formal invitation card, the traditional formula is always a variant of Madame Jean Dupont Restre. The traditional use of the first name of the woman's husband is now felt in this context as a way to include the husband as equally inviting alongside his wife, while keeping the tradition of reception being formally held by the wife. In the workplace or in academic establishments, particularly in a male-dominated environment, it is quite common to refer to male employees by their family name only, but to use Madame or Mademoiselle before the names of female employees. Military. Military officers are addressed by their rank. Male officers of the Army, the Gendarmerie and the Air Force are addressed as mon rank by inferior ranks and deferential civilians. This usage is said not to be the possessive pronoun mon, but an abbreviation of monsieur. However, women are not referred to with mon. Instead the rank alone is used, for example gar copyright na copyright ral rather than mon gar copyright na copyright ral. As a punishment by Napoleon copyright on Bonaparte, Navy officers have not been addressed as mon since the Battle of Trafalgar. Confusingly, the title used does not always match the rank. Lieutenant is the form of address for an ensign de vaisseau, capitaine for a lieutenant de vaisseau and commandant for a capitaine de corvette, fra copyright gate or vaisseau. In everyday written contexts, ranks are abbreviated. Given names, French people have one, two or more given names. One of them, almost always the first, is used in daily life. The others are solely for official documents, such as birth, death and marriage certificates. Thus, one always speaks of Jacques Chirac and never of Jacques Rena copyright Chirac. And Henri Philippe par copyright Taine is always referred to as Philippe par copyright Taine, because Philippe was the given name that he used in daily life. Middle names in the Anglo-Saxon sense do not exist, and middle initials are never used for second or further given names. For example, although English-speaking scientific publications may cite Claude Allegri as Claude J. Allegri, this is never done in France. Typically, second and further given names may be somewhat old-fashioned, given in honor of the child's grandparents etc., though such practice has now become less common. As with English, however, a person may choose to use any one of their names, relegating the unused names to the birth certificate. Although using more than one name is nowadays out of fashion, using two or even three of the given names as a compound name was fairly common until the early 20th century. Traditionally, most people were given names from the Roman Catholic calendar of saints. Common names of this type are Jacques, Jean, Michel, Pierre, or Jean-Baptiste for males, and Marie, Jeanne, Marguerite, French or a Pam Elizabeth for females. In certain regions such as Brittany or Corsica, more local names are often used. However, given names for French citizens from immigrant communities are often from their own culture, such as Mohammed, Karam, Saudi, Tufik, Jorge, etc. for males, Fatima, Vitalmata, etc. for females. Furthermore, in recent decades it has become common to use first names of English of other foreign origin, mainly in the popular classes of the society, such as Kevin, Enzo or Anthony for males. For females, Jessica, Jennifer, Corinne or Barbara. Also, females are often given names like Jacqueline and Gar copyright Roldine that are feminine forms of traditional common masculine French names. The prevalence of given names follows trends, with some names being popular in some years, and some considered definitely out of fashion. As an example, few children born since 1970 would bear the name Germaine, which is generally associated with the idea of an elderly lady. However, as noted above, such old-fashioned names are frequently used as second or third given names, because in France the second or further given names are traditionally those of the godparents or the grandparents. Some older names, such as Suzanne, Violette, Madeleine, have become fashionable again in the upper class and in the upper middle class. Others such as Jean, Pierre, Louis, French never really went out of fashion. Almost all traditional given names are gender-specific. However, a few given names, such as Dominique, Claude and Camille, are given to both males and females. For others, the pronunciation is the same but the spelling is different. Fra copyright Dow copyright Rick / Fra copyright Dow copyright Rick. In medieval times, a woman was often named Philippe, now an exclusively masculine name, or a male Anne, now almost exclusively feminine. From the middle 19th century into the early 20th century, Marie was a popular first name for both men or women. However, before and after this period it has been almost exclusively given to women as a first given name, even if the practice still exists to give it to males as second or third given name, especially in devout Catholic families. Compound given names, such as Jean-Luc, John Paul, or Anne-Sophie are not uncommon. These are not considered to be two separate given names. The second part of a compound name may be a given name normally used by the opposite sex. However, the gender of the compound is determined by the first component. Thus, Marie George Buffet has a given name considered as female because it begins with Marie, and George is spelled with a final E like all the traditional French female given names, instead of Georges with as for a male. The feminine component in male compound names is mostly Marie, as in Jean-Marie Le Pen. In the past, some Frenchmen would have Marie or Anne as first name, which is still nowadays in practice in rare traditional Catholic families. Second or third given names, which usually are kept private, may also include names normally used by the opposite gender. For instance, in 2006, 81 Frenchmen have Brigitte among their given names, 97 Catherine, 133 Anne and 204 Julie. In addition to the above-described custom of using Marie for males, this is due to the habit of traditional Catholic French families to give children the names of their godmother and godfather, if there is no counterpart of the opposite gender for the name of the godparent who is not of the same sex as the child. Generally the name of the godparent will be left as such. For instance, a male child born to a traditional Catholic family choosing for him the name Nicholas and whose godparents are called Christian and var copyright Ronick could be called Nicholas Christian Marie var copyright Ronick. First names are chosen by the child's parents. There are no legal a priori constraints on the choice of names nowadays, but this has not always been the case. The choice of given names, originally limited only by the tradition of naming children after a small number of popular saints, was restricted by law at the end of the 18th century. Officially, only names figuring on a calendar, or names of illustrious Frenchmen women of the past, could be accepted. Much later, actually in 1966, a new law permitted a limited number of mythological, regional or foreign names, substantives, diminutives, and alternative spellings. Only in 1993 were French parents given the freedom to name their child without any constraint whatsoever. However, if the birth registrar thinks that the chosen names may be detrimental to the child's interests, or to the right of other families to protect their own family name, the registrar may refer the matter to the local prosecutor, who may choose to refer the matter to the local court. The court may then refuse the chosen names. Such refusals are rare and mostly concern given names that may expose the child to mockery. To change a given name, a request can be made before a court, but except in a few specific cases, it is necessary to prove a legitimate interest for the change. Family names. In France, until January 1, 2005, children were required by law to take the surname of their father. If the father was unknown, the child had the family name of the mother. Since January 1, 2005, Article 311-21 of the French Civil Code permits parents to give their children either the name of their father, mother, or a hyphenation of both, although no more than two names can be hyphenated. In cases of disagreement, both parents' family names are hyphenated in alphabetic order with only the first of their names if they have a hyphenated name themselves. This brought France into line with a 1978 declaration by the Council of Europe requiring member governments to take measures to adopt equality of rights in the transmission of family names, a measure that was echoed by the United Nations in 1979. Similar measures were adopted by Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Spain and Austria. In France, a person may use a name of a third party in the following circumstances: anyone to add or use the name of a parent whose name he does not bear. This results from the application of Article 43 of Law No. 85/1372 of December 23, 1985. For example, in the case of children of divorced and remarried parents, to help differentiate the family composition, married people or widows by adding or substituting the name of their spouse. Substituting the name of the husband is an established custom but has never been enshrined in law. For example, Social Security laws require the wife and husband to provide the maiden name, or birth name. This right also applies to divorced couples provided that the ex-spouse does not object and the other has a legitimate interest, such as because they have the custody of the couple's children. Since Law No. 2003-516 of June 18, 2003 on the devolution of family names, there is no longer any distinction between the name of the mother and the father. A child may receive the family name of one or the other, or both family names. Decree No. 2004-1159 of October 29, 2004 implemented Law No. 2002-304 of March 4, 2002, provided that children born on or after January 1, 2004 and children changing names, may have or use only the family name of the father or the mother or both family names. However, whichever form is used, a person's name must be used consistently on all identification documents, such as a passport or identity card. The ratio of the number of family names to the population is high in France, due to the fact that most surnames had many orthographic and dialectal variants which were registered as separate names around 1880 when a family vital records booklets were issued. According to the French Institute for Statistics INSEE, more than 1,300,000 surnames were registered in the country between 1891 and 1990, and about 200,000 disappeared meanwhile. It is believed that the number of family names at any time since 1990 hovers between 800,000 and 1,200,000. Not all family names are of French origin, as many families have some immigrant roots. According to different estimations, 50 to 80% of French citizens would be the bearers of rare family names. Most common family names, the list for France is different according to the source. Another list including the births between 1891 and 1990: Chaucer 1, Martin 2, Bernard 3, Thomas 4, Petty 5, Robert 6, Richard 7, Durand 8, Dubois 9, Moreau 10, Laurent. It lists also people who died a long time ago. A more current list of birth between 1966 and 1990 gives 1, Martin 2, Bernard 3, Thomas 4, Robert 5, Petty 6, Dubois 7, Richard 8, Garcia 9, Durand 10, Moreau. However, this list hides strong regional differences in France and the increasing number of foreign names among the French citizens. Table based on births between 1966 and 1990, particles. Some French last names include the word de or du, when it is masculine, and della when it is feminine, but there are regional variations. In the north of France, du is often rendered by deal, and in the south of France, del. When d is separated, it is known as a particle. A particle de should not be alphabetized in name lists, whereas a particule du should be because it results from the contraction of an article. The particule generally indicates some land or feudal origin, but this is not always the case. The name de Gaulle, for example, is not a traditional French name with a particle, but a Flemish-Dutch name evolved from a form of de wall meaning the wall. A popular misconception is that the particule d included in the name always indicates membership of the nobility, that is to say an original separated de that was linked to the name during the French Revolution as de. That is sometimes true. Almost all nobility titles are of the form title particle name of the land, for instance, Louis, Duc de la copyright Anne's, or simply Louis de la copyright Anne's. However, many non-noble people also have particules in their names, simply because they indicate some geographic origin or property. An example from current political life is Dominique de Villepin. Former President Valéry copywriter Y. Giscard d'Estaing's father had his surname legally changed from Giscard to Giscard d'Estaing in 1922, claiming the name of a family line extinct since the French Revolution. Adding a particule was one way for people of non-noble origins to pretend they were nobles. In the 19th century, wealthy laymen buying nobility titles were derisively called Monsieur de Puiseux, a pun on fyp meaning since recently. Similarly, during the French Revolution, when being associated with the nobility was unfashionable and even risky, some people dropped the de from their name, or omitted the mention of their feudal titles. In some cases, names with particles are made of a normal family name and the name of an estate. Thus, Dominique de Villepin is Dominique Galazieu de Villepin. Har copyright lie de Saint-Marc is Har copyright lie de Noix de Saint-Marc. As in these examples, most people with such long family names shorten their name for common use by keeping only the first estate name or, in some cases, only the family name. Whether the family name or the estate name is used for the shortened form depends on a variety of factors, how people feel bearing a particle, tradition, etc. For instance, Valor copywriter Y. Giscard d'Estaing is never referred to as d'Estaing, probably because his particule is a recent addition to the family surname by his father. On the contrary, he is often simply referred to in the press as Giscard. Traditionally, the particule d is omitted when citing the name of a person without a preceding given name, title, job description or polite address. Thus, one would say Monsieur de la Vouville, but if calling him familiarly by his last name only, La Vouville. The same applies for Gar copyright Rade de la Martinière, who would be called La Martinière. Similarly, Philippe de Villiers talks about the votes he receives as Le Vote Villiers. However, this usage is now losing ground to a more egalitarian treatment of surnames. It is, for instance, commonplace to hear people talking of de Villiers. Note that American English language medial capital spellings such as de Villiers are never used in France. Changes of names, contrary to popular belief, and also contrary to the practice of some other countries, French women do not legally change names when they marry. However, it is customary that they take their husband's name as a usage name. This is not a legal obligation and not all women decide to do so. However, if they do, they may retain the use of this name, depending on circumstances, even after a divorce. In some cases, the wife, or even both spouses, choose to adopt a double-barreled surname made from joining the surnames of both partners. Thus, both partners' surnames coexist with whatever usage name they choose. This distinction is important, because many official documents use the person's maiden or legal or true surname, rather than their usage name. People may also choose to use other names in daily usage, as long as they are not impersonating others, and as long as their usage name is socially accepted. One example of this is the custom of actors or singers to use a stage name. However, identity documents and other official documents will only bear the real name of the person. In some cases, people finally change their real name to their stage name. For example, the singer Patrick Bruel changed his name from Bing Guy. Another example of aliases being turned into true name, during World War II, some resistance fighters and Jews fleeing persecution adopted aliases, and some kept the alias as a legal name after the war or added it to their name. Truly changing one's last name, as opposed to adopting a usage name, is quite complex. Such changes have to be made official by a DA copyright cret en conseil de permeltat taken by the Prime Minister after approbation by the Council of State. Requests for such changes must be justified by some legitimate interest, for instance, changing from a foreign name difficult to pronounce in French to a simpler name, or changing from a name with unfavorable connotations. See also, French, list of common French given names at the French Wikipedia, German name, Dutch name, Germanic name, French honorifics, references, general, English, Rouet, Georges. Rouet Burton, Anne. Civil Code. Book I, of Persons, Title II, of Records of Civil Status. La Copyright Française, French, Imprimerie Nationale, Lexique des règles typographiques and usage à l'Imprimerie Nationale, ISBN 2-7433-0482-0, specific. External links, Liste alphabet copyrightique des pra copyright norms, official list of French given names. Prefecture of Police. October 22, 2009. Retrieved February 4, 2010. More French baby names, French female names.